Welcome to Sleepy Journeys, the podcast designed to lull you into a peaceful slumber with soothing stories through time, places, and ideas. Whether you're winding down after a long day or simply looking for a peaceful escape, you're in the right place. My name's Jack, and I'm so happy to have you here with me. Each night on Sleepy Journeys, we set off together on gentle adventures designed to soothe your mind and ease you into rest. You'll find journeys through history, comforting fairy tales, myths and folklore, the wonders of science, fascinating inventions, inspiring famous figures, music history, and even calm explorations around the world. No matter where your curiosity takes you, there's a dreamy Sleepy Journeys show for you. Tonight, we're going to embark on a gentle journey through A Stroll Through VE Day. So get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. It is a soft spring morning in the year 1945. The air carries a tender chill, the kind that lingers just a little longer before the warmth of the sun gently nudges it away. Around the cities, villages, and countryside of Europe, blossoms have begun to unfurl, reaching toward light with quiet certainty. Branches sway with the weight of new leaves, and the earth, scarred yet enduring, breathes in a hush of awakening. War, long and wearying, has stretched its shadow across the world for 6 arduous years. But now, there's a stillness. Not the kind born of dread or hesitation, but one woven from cautious hope, an almost imperceptible shift, like the silence before birdsong at dawn. Streets that once echoed with the hollow thunder of boots and sirens are quieter now. Radios murmur softly in parlors and kitchens, voices tuned to distant broadcasts. People are listening, waiting, wondering if the tide has truly turned. Victory in Europe Day, or VE Day, as it would come to be known, would mark more than just a military conclusion. It would become a collective exhale, a moment suspended between grief and gratitude, sorrow and solace. It would hold within it the last threads of fear, slowly unraveling into relief. This evening, we'll gently wander through that extraordinary day, not as historians tracing battles, but as silent companions drifting along cobbled lanes, through shadowed parlors and sunlit town squares, where ordinary people quietly experienced the extraordinary. We'll visit the final, flickering days before the war's end, the first ripples of peace moving across time zones, and the many ways joy unfolded in public squares and private hearts alike. We'll feel the comforting hum of crowds gathering in Trafalgar Square, the golden light slowly returning to a blackout-weary London, the tender rekindling of Paris's streets, and the subtle smiles exchanged between strangers in Times Square. We'll read over the shoulders of those writing letters, hear the soft scratch of pens in diaries, and explore how the echoes of VE Day continue in the world's memory. But for now, take a deep breath. Let the scent of blooming lilac and chimney smoke blend into a calming haze. Imagine the soft patter of shoes on damp pavement, the hushed clink of teacups on saucers, the distant toll of church bells. Let it all surround you like a comforting quilt, stitched from shared history and quiet hope. Tonight is not about noise or spectacle. It's about peace, gentle, slow, and deeply earned. And so, we begin our stroll through VE Day. The final days of the Second World War in Europe arrived not with a sudden, thunderous stop, but rather like the fading hum of a distant storm slowly giving way to silence. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath. In the fields of France and the woodlands of Germany, along winding roads in the Netherlands, and among the ruins of towns once bustling with life, there was a hush. A soft expectancy. A lull that seemed to settle like morning mist. The Allied advance was steady now. It had lost its earlier bursts of desperate momentum and instead moved forward with a quiet confidence. Soldiers walked with heavy boots on muddy roads, not rushing, but placing each step with the patience of those who knew the end was near. Tank engines rumbled, not with fury, but with fatigue. A different kind of silence spread across the countryside, one filled with anticipation rather than dread. Villagers peeked out from behind curtains or from cellars where they'd waited out the danger for years. Children clutched the hands of mothers who couldn't yet believe the quiet was safe. The spring sun, pale and gentle, shone down on fields once scorched by battle, now green again with new growth. The trees, some gnarled from years of shelling and smoke, bloomed nonetheless, casting dappled shadows across the pathways of both civilians and soldiers alike. In the countryside, the signs were subtle. A farmhouse rehoisting a flag from a dusty trunk, a local church chiming at odd hours as if to signal something important, and small knots of people whispering by well pumps and fences. These were not celebrations yet, but something more tentative, soft ripples of belief that perhaps the end was finally in sight. In places like Brussels and Antwerp, where liberation had arrived months earlier, the mood was more assured. But even there, the knowledge that Berlin was surrounded and that enemy resistance was buckling brought with it a strange stillness. It was as though the continent were holding itself in balance, not daring to believe in peace until it had fully arrived. Among the Allied soldiers themselves, the mood was not jubilant, but deeply contemplative. Letters home were filled with cautious optimism. Maybe next month, one might write. Or, the men say this could be it. Some units had taken to planting small flowers near their tents, and in towns they passed through, soldiers could be seen walking slowly, noticing the details they'd previously missed, the way ivy curled over a stone wall, or the way a barn door creaked in the wind. The radio reports had become gentler too. There was still grim news to share, still towns in need of liberation and suffering to witness, but each broadcast carried within it the growing sense that the days of destruction were waning. The sounds of gunfire still echoed in some places, but between the bursts, there was an unmistakable quiet. A quiet filled with anticipation, the kind that settles in a person's chest when they know something is changing, something vast and irreversible. And yet, for now, they wait. They listen to the wind. They hold their breath. They hope. It didn't come as a single moment, this realization that the war in Europe was nearing its end. Instead, it unfolded slowly, like dawn stretching its fingers across a weary sky. There were no fanfares in the beginning, no loud announcements or grand declarations. just small changes, whispered words, shared glances, and a gentle lightness that began to drift through hearts once clenched in fear. In homes across Europe, radios became companions once more, not just instruments of warning. The news was still careful, still wrapped in cautious phrases, but the tone had changed. There were fewer reports of losses and more of gains. Phrases like advancing forces and enemy retreat were spoken with a kind of reverence. The rhythm of the language changed, softening. Even the static between broadcasts seemed quieter, less urgent. People began to look upward more often, not out of fear for enemy planes, but out of habit, only to find blue skies where once there had been smoke. The sounds that once haunted the night, air raid sirens, distant explosions, hurried footsteps on cobblestone, had quieted. In their place, there were new sounds, birdsong returning to hedgerows, church bells tolling more freely, and the soft rustle of trees swaying in the breeze, no longer stripped by fire. In places like Rome, Amsterdam, and Vienna, where suffering had etched itself deep into stone and soul, there came brief moments of stillness that hinted at something else. Neighbors who had not spoken in years due to fear or loss began to nod to one another. Shopkeepers dared to leave signs in windows again, and the scent of bread, real bread, returned to the air in narrow alleys and quiet courtyards. The armies themselves could feel it too. Dispatches slowed. Patrols relaxed, if only slightly. Orders still came, and movement still continued, but with an underlying feeling that the long push might soon end. Commanders paused to listen to the wind. Soldiers stopped to watch clouds roll lazily across the horizon. Some wrote home with words they'd barely allowed themselves before: hope, peace, home. In small chapels and places of quiet worship, candles were lit not just for protection, but for gratitude. Prayers whispered on worn benches became softer, more certain. Not all were joyful. Many held sorrow for those lost, but they held within them something delicate and enduring, the idea that healing could begin. The children sensed it too. Their games took on lighter tones. Chalk drawings reappeared on sidewalks, crude flowers and stick figures smiling under suns with wide, beaming faces. In playgrounds once silent, laughter dared to return. It was the kind of laughter that tiptoed in, unsure if it was welcome, but staying anyway. And so, like the petals of a flower slowly unfolding after a long winter, the realization came. Peace, once a distant and fragile dream, was now a shape on the horizon. Not quite here. Not quite real. But close enough to believe in. Close enough to wait for with open arms and quiet hearts. Subsection 2.2.1 The gentle spread of news across different time zones. When the news finally arrived that the war in Europe had ended, it did not fall like thunder. It flowed, soft and steady, across the curvature of the earth. It traveled by airwaves, over oceans, and through wires, threading its way gently from continent to continent, hour by hour, moment by moment. In London, the announcement came first as rumor. Then, quietly, from the lips of radio broadcasters whose voices held a tremble not from fear, but from the weight of the words they were chosen to deliver. The message was brief, but it carried with it the sigh of a world long held in breath: victory in Europe. As Big Ben chimed over the city, the news spread from flat to flat, from bakeries to buses, and from doorsteps to town squares. Those who heard it first looked at one another with disbelief, then with tentative relief. It was true. At last, it was true. The radio waves didn't stop there. They leapt the English Channel, floating across the skies to towns still healing from occupation. In Paris, where cafes had begun to open their shutters with a little more ease, the announcement came in the early afternoon. The voices of Allied broadcasters echoed off stone buildings and into narrow streets, passing from table to table like a cherished secret. Peace. Europe was free. The city, its heart bruised but beating, stood still, absorbing the words like rain on thirsty soil. Farther east, in countries that had borne occupation longest, the news crept in gently. It found its way through resistance broadcasts and whispered translations. In Prague, the news mingled with the soft bells of May blossoms and the sounds of footsteps on cobblestones. The city, half liberated, still in tension, received it not with cheers, but with tears, tears of fatigue, of longing, of release. As the earth turned, the message moved with it. Across time zones and sleeping landscapes, it traveled westward. In the early hours of morning in Newfoundland, the news was shared around kitchen tables and early shift coffee counters. In the small towns of Nova Scotia and rural Quebec, people paused their morning routines, irons left cooling, porridge left on the stove, to gather around the soft glow of the radio. Peace. Finally, peace. In New York and Washington, it arrived mid-morning. Office workers stopped mid-typing. Secretaries and shopkeepers leaned closer to radios. Church bells began to toll across the city, slowly at first, then steadily. The news spread in concentric circles, gentle ripples across a still lake. In the farms of the Midwest, it came with the sun's rising light. Farmers paused beside tractors, milk pails were set down mid-morning chore, and families stepped outside, listening to the wind as if it too carried the echo of peace. On the Pacific coast, where dawn had not yet broken, the message waited patiently in wires and telegrams, in headlines soon to be read over morning coffee. The world had changed while they slept. It was not a moment that belonged to one place or one time, but rather to many, stitched together across time zones like a quiet quilt of shared relief. The words may have arrived at different hours, spoken in many tongues, but the feeling was the same everywhere. The war in Europe was over, and the world exhaled. The announcement came not only through radios and headlines, but through rooms, hearts, and lives, one soul at a time. It was received in kitchens and factory floors, on quiet hillsides, and in crowded stairwells. And in each of these places, it left behind a pause, a hush, a moment in which time seemed to hold its breath, so that those listening could understand what they had just heard. In a London row house, a woman stood at the sink, hands submerged in dishwater gone cold. The wireless had been playing in the background, a gentle accompaniment to the rhythm of her thoughts. But when the words came through, low and clear, she stopped. The sponge slid from her fingers, and her breath caught in her throat. Her son had left for France 2 years ago. And now, with the water still dripping from her hands, she turned toward the radio and listened, not with her ears, but with her entire being. Across the English countryside, in a thatched cottage tucked between blossoming hedgerows, an old man sat with a cup of tea, warming his palms. The fire had burned low, its embers glowing softly, casting flickers of orange on the walls. The broadcast, scratchy and slow, spoke of surrender, of finality, of peace. The man closed his eyes, thinking of trenches and fields from decades ago. He nodded once and whispered to no one, "It's over." In a Parisian attic, 3 young women huddled around a small set. They had lived through fear and hiding, through the shadows of silence and resistance. When the news reached them, they did not cry out. Instead, they sat quietly, heads bowed together, hands linked. One of them placed a delicate white flower into a jar on the windowsill, where it caught the morning light. In a small Bavarian village, a boy no older than 10 ran through the dusty lanes, his voice calling to others, "Der Krieg ist vorbei." The war's over. His words echoed through the streets, bouncing off stones and shuttered windows. A baker leaned against his doorway, flour still dusting his apron. He didn't speak, only wiped his brow and looked at the sky. It was quiet, blessedly quiet. On a Pennsylvania farm, a family gathered around the tall wooden cabinet where their radio sat, humming softly. The father placed a hand on his wife's shoulder as the announcement unfolded. The children, unsure what it meant, looked up at their mother, who smiled without speaking. She bent to her youngest and simply said, "Your daddy might come home soon." The little one nodded, as if that was all they needed to know. And in cities, in villages, in homes with cracked windows and hearts still healing, people stood still. They did not all cheer. Some wept. Break, time 1.0s. Some closed their eyes and breathed deeply. Some fell to their knees, not in grief, but in the overwhelming calm that came with knowing the worst had passed. These were not moments for parades or fireworks. They were quiet, sacred seconds where the world tilted, just slightly, back toward peace. And in that stillness, countless people across continents felt a soft, collective knowing the war was over and life could begin again. The heart of London had long pulsed with determination and endurance, and on this spring day in 1945, it pulsed again, this time with quiet joy. As the news of victory spread across the city, people began to drift toward its familiar landmarks, drawn as if by instinct, by memory, or by the desire to not be alone as the moment settled in. Trafalgar Square was the first to stir. The great lions stood as they always had, proud and still, guardians of a city that had endured much. Beneath them, people gathered, not in a rush or frenzy, but gradually, gently. A young man in uniform leaned against one of the fountains, the ripples of water glinting in the soft sunlight. A girl nearby clutched a small Union Jack flag, its corners fluttering in the breeze like the hem of a child's dress in a summer wind. There were no grand orchestras, no triumphant marching bands, only the layered sounds of footsteps, voices, and the occasional spontaneous song, soft and reverent, more lullaby than anthem. People sang not to be heard, but to remember, to connect. Down the Mall, the long avenue leading to Buckingham Palace, people wandered slowly, as if they had all the time in the world. Couples strolled hand in hand, parents with children perched on shoulders, elderly men with walking sticks tapping a quiet rhythm on the cobblestones. Bunting appeared, not all at once, but in small, spontaneous bursts, strung between lampposts and draped from balconies by hands eager to decorate a city long deprived of color. A mother sat on a bench near St. James's Park, holding her daughter close. The child held a sandwich wrapped in paper, forgotten in the moment, her wide eyes fixed on the scene unfolding. They had lived through the worst of the Blitz together, and now they sat under a sky that held only clouds, no planes. Near the palace gates, a gentle hush fell. People had gathered to see the royal family, and when they finally appeared on the balcony, the crowd swelled, but did not roar. There were cheers, yes, but they were soft, respectful. Queen Elizabeth and King George stood with their daughters, waving quietly. There was something deeply human in the way they looked out, not as monarchs above the people, but as fellow citizens, sharing in a moment too large for words. Winston Churchill, too, made an appearance, his familiar figure greeted with admiration. But even then, the applause was tempered by the weight of memory. The people had not forgotten what it took to reach this day. They remembered the nights spent in shelters, the letters never answered, the silhouettes against burning skies. And so they celebrated not with riotous noise, but with stillness, with presence, and with tears. As the afternoon wore on, shadows lengthened. The sounds of the crowd softened further, conversations turning to murmurs, embraces becoming longer. Some lit candles. Some left flowers at statues and fountains. Others simply stood in place, eyes closed, feeling the air as though it were new again. London had waited 6 long years for this day. And now, under the delicate glow of the early evening sun, its people stood together, not shouting, but breathing, resting, and beginning, at last, to heal. As the twilight deepened over London on that May evening, a quiet transformation began to unfold, one that touched not only the buildings and streets, but the hearts of all who watched. For the first time in nearly 6 years, the city would welcome back the light. It began subtly. A flicker in a high window. A lamp turned on behind drawn curtains. Then, slowly, more windows glowed like fireflies at rest, casting golden halos on the rooftops and along the quiet pavements below. The blackout, long and dutifully obeyed, had begun to lift. And with it, the darkness that had cloaked the city in shadow began to drift away. The soft buzz of electricity returned to places where it had been absent for years. Light bulbs glowed not with harsh brilliance, but with a gentle warmth, like the hum of a lullaby at bedtime. Street lamps blinked to life in their glassy housings, pools of amber forming on the damp cobblestones. The city, which had grown used to the hush of darkened nights, now blushed softly with light, hesitant but hopeful. People stood in doorways, hands folded over cardigans and coats, simply watching. Children pointed up at glowing windows, their laughter quiet but unrestrained. Couples walking arm in arm paused beneath newly lit signs, some blinking uncertainly, some shining steadily, as though they had never been turned off. Theaters that had gone dark during the war lit their marquees again, even if there were no performances scheduled. The names of old plays and performers shimmered above entrances, as if waiting for applause. Bookshops turned on reading lamps in their front windows, casting pools of light on titles that had sat dusty and waiting. It was not the bright blaze of celebration. It was a return to comfort, to habit, to home. In Hyde Park, the pathways were dotted with lanterns and torches. People wandered there, drawn by the silence and the scent of spring flowers newly revealed under the glow. Lovers whispered on benches, their faces half lit by the flame of a single lamp. A violinist stood quietly under an archway, playing not for an audience, but for the sky, for the stars that now peeked out between wisps of cloud. And above it all, the skyline of London seemed to breathe again. The outlines of the dome of St. Paul's and the spires of Westminster were silhouetted against a sky that no longer feared bombardment. The night held no wailing sirens, no searchlights scanning for shadows, no thud of distant bombs. Instead, there was only the murmur of voices, the clink of teacups, and the golden hush of light returning. For many, the most moving moment came not from celebration, but from ritual. At precisely 10 o'clock, a handful of homes turned off their lights once more, not from necessity, but in remembrance. They stood in darkness for 1 minute, then lit candles in their windows. The flames flickered gently, a silent tribute to the lives lost, and a promise that the light would never again be taken for granted. In this glow, soft and unassuming, London was no longer just a city of resilience. It became, once again, a city of warmth, a place where the night could be peaceful and the darkness could give way to hope. In Paris, the light returned not with a sudden spark, but with a soft and steady glow, as if the city had been waiting patiently to breathe again. The news of peace drifted through its winding streets and shuttered courtyards like a spring breeze. Slowly, carefully, the city of light rekindled its soul. By the banks of the Seine, the waters moved gently, catching the glimmer of lanterns newly hung from balconies. They flickered like stars descended to earth, their reflections stretching across the river in long, wavering lines. Couples strolled along the quayside, fingers intertwined, their steps slow and deliberate. No one hurried that evening. There was nothing to flee from, only the luxury of time and of stillness. In the cafes, life began to return in little bursts. Waiters polished glasses behind wooden counters worn by years of absence and dust. Small clusters of neighbors gathered around tin tables on sidewalks, steam rising from cups of coffee and delicate plates of cheese and bread. Some spoke in hushed tones, while others simply sat, looking out onto the street, as if memorizing the peacefulness of it all. The Eiffel Tower stood tall against the evening sky, its iron lattice quiet and dignified. Lights blinked on, tentative at first, then one by one, creating a gentle cascade of gold up its frame. It wasn't the spectacle it had once been, no fanfare, no crowds gathered just for its brilliance, but it glowed as it had not in years. Not in triumph, but in welcome. In the gardens of the Palais Royal, the trees had filled out again, and people wandered beneath them. Some walked alone, their thoughts private, others with friends and family, pausing on benches to take in the hush that had settled over the city. Fountains whispered, and pigeons cooed softly in the eaves. A man played a quiet tune on an old accordion near the colonnade, each note meandering like a ribbon on the breeze. There was no clapping, just the occasional nod or smile from passers-by. Artists returned to Montmartre, their canvases propped against familiar walls. They painted slowly, not because they were unsure of their subjects, but because there was time to savor each stroke. They painted lamplit windows, flower cellars, lovers beneath parasols, things they had once only imagined during the silence of war. In the Marais, a grandmother unfolded a white cloth over a long table outside her home. Her family, gathered once more, brought out small dishes, lentils, olives, soft cheese, each plate a token of celebration, humble and precious. Laughter flowed in soft waves. A toddler, unbothered by the solemnity of history, toddled beneath the table, chasing a napkin caught in the breeze. As night deepened, the air carried a mix of scent and sound, fresh bread, candle wax, tobacco, the creak of shutters being opened instead of closed. And above it all, the bells began to ring. Not in alarm or sorrow, but in joy. Slowly at first, then more, from the Notre Dame to Sacré-Cœur, a chorus of bronze voices rang out into the Parisian night. This was not a city erupting in celebration. It was a city exhaling, gently, finally, fully. The city of light was aglow once more, not just in its streets, but in its heart. Far from the bustling cities and the gathered crowds, in small towns newly freed from occupation, VE Day unfolded like a whispered prayer. These were places where celebration was softer, where voices were lowered out of reverence, and where every smile carried with it the shadow of what had been lost. And yet, even here, perhaps especially here, peace arrived like sunlight, filtering through lace curtains, quiet, delicate, and long-awaited. In a stone village nestled among the hills of southern Belgium, the streets remained mostly still as the news made its way across the rooftops. A church bell rang gently, not for a service or a warning, but simply to mark the moment. An old woman stepped outside her door and looked down the lane. She had heard bells like this before, for weddings, for funerals, for the arrival of enemy tanks, but today the sound felt different. Lighter. Free. She set a small table outside her door, placing upon it a vase of lilacs and a candle. There was no banner, no parade, just the soft flicker of flame and the scent of new blossoms, drifting out to meet the breeze. Neighbors followed suit. Not many. Just a few. Enough to remind each other that they were not alone, that peace was something they could begin to trust again. In a town square in central Italy, where vines grew along the remnants of a broken clock tower, children gathered. They carried sticks like batons and marched clumsily to the beat of a toy drum. Their laughter rose above the cobblestones and echoed off the walls of shuttered shops. Watching from a distance, parents smiled, though some wiped at their eyes. For many of them, it was the first time in years they had seen their children play without fear. In a narrow lane in northern France, a priest unlocked the wooden doors of a small chapel that had stood silent since occupation. Inside, the candles had long melted to stubs, and dust lingered in the air like a faded hymn. He lit a single taper and placed it before the altar. Then he opened the doors wide, allowing the morning light to spill in. Soon, others came, a farmer and his wife, a young seamstress, two boys still in school uniform, each one silent, each one offering a moment of stillness. In the alpine foothills of Austria, peace was felt in the simplest gestures. A family hung freshly washed linens on a line that stretched between apple trees. A grandfather tuned his old radio to a Vienna station, smiling faintly at the calm voices on the air. Down the road, a teenage girl tied a blue ribbon in her hair and walked to the edge of a field where wildflowers were blooming, flowers she hadn't dared to pick in years. She knelt quietly and gathered a small bouquet. These were not places of grand speeches or waving flags. They were places where liberation had come at a high cost and where joy returned slowly, carefully, step by step. In these towns, the day was not marked by noise, but by presence, by standing still long enough to feel the warmth of the sun, by listening to the quiet and recognizing it as something precious. And in these quiet moments, nestled between memories and meadows, peace did not announce itself. It simply arrived and stayed. In the heart of Manhattan, where streets often pulsed with energy and sound, the news of victory in Europe arrived like a soft tide rolling in from across the Atlantic. It didn't erupt all at once, but settled gradually into the early hours of May 8th, as if even this great, sleepless city knew to be still for a moment. Times Square, with its bright signs and bustling pace, became a quiet place of gathering that day. Not hushed entirely, but subdued, softened. People drifted there not in jubilation, but in quiet companionship. Office workers stepped out from buildings, sailors and soldiers mingled among civilians, and families held hands as they approached the square, each person feeling the pull of a moment too large to take in alone. The news tickers, wrapped around buildings like glowing ribbons, delivered the message in their usual methodical pace, Germany surrenders. War in Europe ends. But those words, though simple, landed like a long-awaited embrace. People looked up, reading them again and again, letting their meaning unfold with each repetition. As the morning gave way to afternoon, more arrived. Not in waves, but in ripples. A woman in a broad hat handed out small American flags, each one folded with care. A group of young men in uniform stood shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed, their smiles faint but real. Nearby, an elderly man held a black and white photograph close to his chest. No one asked who it was. They simply offered him space. The buildings around Times Square, so often aglow with advertisements and color, seemed to take on a different tone. The lights remained, but their flicker felt more graceful. Stores left their doors open, and jazz music, low and warm, spilled out onto the sidewalks like afternoon sunlight. The horns of passing taxis seemed to sound more like distant boat whistles, unhurried and mellow. A young couple stood at the corner of 47th Street, arms wrapped around one another. They didn't speak much. The man, recently returned from Europe, had shared little of what he'd seen. But now, in this place, with the crowd gently shifting around them, their silence spoke volumes. Their presence, the simple act of standing still together, was its own celebration. Across the square, a few people began to dance. Not the exuberant, leaping kind, but something slower, gentler, a waltz, perhaps, remembered from before the war. Others joined in pairs or trios, not to be seen, but to remember how it felt to move freely again. Laughter bubbled up here and there, shy at first, then more confident, like springtime birdsong finding its rhythm again. As dusk approached, the sky above the city turned a soft shade of lavender. The electric signs brightened, casting a warm, golden hue on the faces below. No speeches echoed through the streets. There was no central voice leading the crowd. Just thousands of individuals, each carrying their own blend of grief and gratitude, coming together in a moment of calm unity. And though the square would later become a symbol of celebration in photographs and newsreels, in that moment, it was something quieter, a place where strangers became companions, and peace, so long delayed, was quietly welcomed home. Across the vast and varied landscapes of the United States, from sleepy coastal towns to quiet plains and the gentle curves of inland hills, the news of the war's end in Europe made its way gently, like a soft current drifting over calm waters. For many Americans on the home front, the news was not met with roaring parades or raucous fanfare, but with a deep, reverent pause, a silence filled with feeling. In a farmhouse tucked between fields of young corn in Iowa, a mother stood at the stove, the radio perched nearby, its wooden frame humming low and steady. The broadcast was calm, deliberate. When the words came, "Victory in Europe. Germany has surrendered," she placed the wooden spoon beside the pot and sat down at the kitchen table. Her hands folded instinctively. A quiet moment passed before she reached across the table to adjust the photo of her son in uniform. A letter from him lay just beneath it, neatly folded. In a neighborhood in Savannah, Georgia, the sun filtered through Spanish moss hanging from old oak trees. On front porches, neighbors gathered, not in large numbers, but in little circles of chairs and glances. The conversations were soft, like the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Some offered lemonade. Others simply listened, letting the silence between their words speak for them. In a modest apartment in Detroit, a factory worker removed her cap and sat by the window, the hum of machinery still echoing faintly in her bones. She had worked long hours through the war effort, riveting, inspecting, assembling, never knowing if it made the difference she hoped it would. Now, as the city outside seemed to hold its breath, she let herself exhale. Not in celebration, but in peace. She watched the people passing below, couples arm in arm, a father lifting his child onto his shoulders, and for the first time in a long while, she felt something settle inside her. In a schoolroom in Vermont, the teacher stood before a group of children whose young lives had been framed by war. She told them gently, with a hand to her heart, that it was over, in Europe at least. A few of the older boys looked away, unsure how to process the idea. One girl raised her hand and asked if her brother might come home sooner now. The teacher smiled softly, then nodded. In small towns and cities alike, church bells tolled. Not in a loud chorus, but in slow, rhythmic peals. They were not calling people to gather, but marking the hour, this day, as sacred. Some families took evening walks they hadn't allowed themselves in months. The air smelled of lilac and cut grass, and the sky was awash with soft golds and blues. Dinner tables that night were a little quieter, a little fuller. Candles were lit in remembrance and gratitude. Prayers were spoken slowly. And in many homes, eyes lingered a moment longer on empty chairs, on telegrams tucked into drawers, on uniforms hanging silently behind bedroom doors. For those who waited, who worked, who watched from afar, VE Day was not only a turning point in history, it was a moment of quiet transition from fear to peace, from separation to hope. It was not the end of all sorrow, but the beginning of stillness. And in that stillness, the home front finally allowed itself to breathe. In the quiet hours of Victory in Europe Day, as cities stirred and bells tolled, many turned inward. With pen in hand and paper smoothed beneath their fingertips, people across the world leaned into stillness to record what their voices could not yet say aloud. Letters were written with care. Diaries opened after long neglect. And on these fragile pages, the softness of the day found a resting place. In a modest bedroom on the second floor of a terraced house in Manchester, a young woman sat at her writing desk, the drawer slightly ajar, revealing envelopes carefully tucked beneath fabric scraps and bits of string. She picked up her pen and began her letter. "Dear Thomas," she wrote, the ink flowing slowly. "The streets were quiet this morning, but the air felt different, as if London was exhaling. They say it's over, the war in Europe anyway. The shopkeeper smiled at me when I bought bread. A real smile, not the kind we've learned to fake. I thought of you today and all the times we waited for this moment. In a small village in Denmark, a boy of 12 sat on the edge of his bed, legs swinging over the side, pencil clutched tightly in his hand. His diary, worn at the edges, lay open to a new page. He wrote without knowing who might ever read it. Mama cried when the radio spoke. Papa didn't say much. He just went outside and stood looking at the tree that still stands by our gate. I think he's remembering grandfather. I think we all are. Thousands of miles away, on a porch in rural Virginia, an elderly man dipped his fountain pen into its inkwell and began a letter to his sister. His handwriting was slow, deliberate, sloping gently to the right. It is quiet here today. Not the fearful kind of quiet, but something softer. I walked out to the creek after breakfast and sat on that flat rock we always liked. The sky was so blue it almost didn't look real. I think the birds knew. They were louder this morning. Maybe they're celebrating in their own way. In Paris, in the early hours after the announcement, a woman reopened a journal she hadn't touched since her husband was taken. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned the pages. Then, slowly, she began to write. I heard the bells first. They rang like they used to when we were young. I stood at the window, and the neighbors began to come out, one by one. No one said anything. We just stood, listening. I lit a candle for Henri, not because he is coming home, but because he would have wanted to hear those bells. Not all the words were hopeful. Some were uncertain, some marked by sorrow. But all were quiet, sincere, and filled with the depth of the human spirit. In those lines and loops, in ink smudged by fingertips or tears, was a reflection of a world shifting from war to peace. These letters and diaries, often tucked away in drawers or passed hand to hand, did not shout or boast. They simply bore witness to a sunrise after years of darkness, to a moment held in the stillness of a page, and to the hearts that, even in silence, knew how to speak. While some celebrated with crowds and others with pen and paper, many marked VE Day with small, quiet acts of joy, gestures that spoke softly, yet deeply, of relief. These were the moments that would not make headlines or fill history books, but they settled into the corners of memory like sunlight through a lace curtain, warm and gentle. In a narrow lane in Yorkshire, a baker opened his shutters before dawn. For years, the windows had remained dark, the glass covered each night to protect against air raids. But on this morning, with birds singing their early chorus and the scent of lilacs curling along the garden fence, he decided to bake something special. Using flour that had been carefully saved, he prepared warm loaves, the kind with a golden crust and a touch of sugar on top. By midday, the scent filled the street and neighbors came one by one, each receiving a loaf, a smile, and the quiet comfort of something familiar returning. In a small town in Maine, a family set a picnic on the lawn for the first time in years. The father unfolded a woolen blanket, worn thin at the edges, while the mother arranged sandwiches and hard-boiled eggs in a woven basket. Their 3 children ran barefoot in the grass, chasing each other in slow, dizzying circles. A neighbor wandered over with a jar of raspberry jam and joined them, sitting cross-legged and watching the clouds drift by. No one said much. There was no need. The simple act of sitting outside together felt like a gift. Elsewhere, in a Berlin apartment missing windows but still standing, a young woman opened the shutters and let the sunlight spill across the room. Her mother lit a small candle beside a vase of wildflowers and played a lullaby on the old, slightly out-of-tune piano. The sound drifted down the stairwell, and someone on the floor below joined in with a quiet hum. Just a few notes. Just a moment. But it was enough to remind them that music, like peace, could return. On a canal bridge in Amsterdam, 2 teenagers sat side by side, legs dangling over the water. They shared an apple, passing it back and forth between bites. Boats moved slowly beneath them, the sound of water lapping gently against the wood. One of them pointed to the horizon, where sunlight caught the tops of the church steeples. Neither spoke. Their hands rested beside each other, close but not touching, grounded in the comfort of simply being there, together, alive and unafraid. In a London neighborhood, a cat wandered through an open gate and into a garden where an elderly man was tending his roses. The cat rubbed against his legs, purring softly. He reached down and lifted it into his arms, holding it close as he sat in a sun-warmed chair. He had seen too much, lost too many. But as he stroked the soft fur, his shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to rest. These were the scenes of VE Day that often went unnoticed. The quiet conversations over tea, the children drawing chalk hearts on sidewalks, the laughter that returned to kitchens and doorsteps. They were the small notes of a greater song, each one gentle and true. And in these simple, tender moments, the world began to remember not just how to celebrate, but how to live. As peace settled over Europe like a soft shawl draped over tired shoulders, there was a quiet undercurrent that stirred in the hearts of many. For even as bells tolled and lights returned, a solemn truth remained: the war was not yet over. Across oceans and islands, in a different corner of the world, the conflict in the Pacific still raged on. In homes and hearts across the Allied nations, this knowledge rested gently but firmly, a reminder that joy could not yet be complete. Families who had rejoiced at the news from Europe held on a little longer to telegrams and photographs from the Pacific, waiting still. There was no bitterness in their restraint, only reverence. The celebration was real, but it was measured, balanced on the quiet understanding that peace was still a hope, not a reality, for many. In San Diego, where the Pacific wind carried the scent of salt and sea, naval families gathered near the waterfront. Mothers with strollers, wives with folded letters in hand, fathers watching the horizon, all looked out toward the ocean that carried their loved ones far away. The harbor, dotted with ships under repair or preparing to sail again, stood still under the golden glow of afternoon. A soft murmur passed among them. Soon, we hope. It was spoken not as a wish, but as a prayer. In Sydney, Australia, where Anzac families bore their own share of loss and duty, the radio broadcast brought news of Europe's peace with a blend of warmth and gravity. There was a tenderness in the public addresses, one that honored the moment without forgetting those still serving in New Guinea, Borneo, and the Philippines. Flowers were placed at war memorials, not only in joy, but in solemn recognition that another chapter still remained to be closed. On islands like Saipan and Okinawa, and in ships drifting across the wide Pacific, soldiers and sailors received the news in moments that felt both distant and personal. A group of Marines, resting beside their tents under starlit skies, passed a torn newspaper from hand to hand. No one cheered. Instead, they sat quietly, each man absorbing the news in his own way. One lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. Another stared into the distance, hands folded behind his head, listening to the night sounds, crickets, ocean waves, and the occasional rumble of an engine. They were glad, deeply glad, for their brothers in Europe. But they knew their own path was not yet finished. Their letters home would now include the hope that their turn would come soon, that the world would know peace in full, not in part. Back in England and America, church services gave thanks while also offering prayers for the Pacific. Candlelight vigils included moments of silence not just for the fallen, but for the yet unknown. And in every village and city, there were homes where the Union Jack or the Stars and Stripes flew at half-mast, not in protest, but in patience. A quiet promise that celebration could wait until all were safe. Victory in Europe was a precious thing. But it was held gently, with care, humility, and an awareness of the oceans still to be crossed, the burdens still borne. And so the world, while rejoicing, also waited. With hearts full of hope and eyes turned eastward, they watched and prayed for the day when peace would be complete. As the echoes of celebration slowly faded into gentle memory, there emerged a new kind of stillness, not one marked by absence or uncertainty, but by purpose. Across towns and cities, villages and countryside, people began to turn their thoughts toward the future. Quietly, steadily, the work of rebuilding had begun. It started in small, almost invisible ways. In London, the first shopkeepers returned to boarded-up storefronts, gently peeling away paper from display windows long kept in shadow. Inside, the shelves were dusty, the counters bare, but there was movement again. A man adjusted a sign by the door. "We'll reopen soon." Just 4 words, scrawled in pencil on a torn scrap of card, but they carried the weight of renewal. Elsewhere, in neighborhoods where buildings had been damaged or destroyed, the scent of damp plaster and wood mingled with the warmth of spring air. Workers in simple caps and rolled sleeves cleared debris with quiet focus. There were no large machines, no rushing deadlines, just the methodical rhythm of hands and shovels, of bricks being set back into place. The sounds were steady and soft, sweeping, hammering, the low murmur of conversation between neighbors rediscovering their strength. In the gardens behind terraced homes and beside rural cottages, people planted again. Seeds were pressed into freshly turned soil, not as acts of survival, but of hope. Rows of beans, potatoes, and herbs began to line plots that had once grown silent under ash. Children helped alongside their parents, patting the earth smooth and watering the roots with tin cans. Each green shoot was a quiet declaration: life continues. Churches and town halls reopened their doors, not for grand ceremonies, but for shared planning. Long tables were laid out with maps and supply lists. Volunteers, many with sleeves rolled and hair pinned back, gathered around with notebooks and pencils, their voices gentle but purposeful. There was so much to do: schools to reopen, hospitals to mend, families to locate, but no one spoke of it with panic. Only with a calm sense of duty. In classrooms, chalkboards were cleaned and desks pulled from storage. Teachers stood in doorways, their eyes sweeping over the empty rows with something like reverence. Many children had not sat in a classroom for years, but the smell of chalk and the sound of a bell ringing again would become part of their lives once more. The future, tentative and fragile, was beginning to shape itself. In communities once fractured by war, friendships re-emerged, slow and steady. A neighbor offered help fixing a door. A family shared sugar or coal. Conversations, once hushed by fear, found volume again, not loud, but open. Slowly, kindness took root where suspicion had lived. Even in cities where ruins still lingered, cracked stones and silent spires, there was movement. A young architect sketched ideas on a pad by candlelight. A seamstress set up her table on the sidewalk, stitching uniforms into children's clothes. Music began to float from windows, and books reappeared in library cases, handled with care and wonder. The rebuilding was not simply of walls and roads. It was of hearts, of trust, of memory. It was quiet, deliberate, and deeply human. And in that calm, steady effort, in the sweeping, the planting, the planning, the world reminded itself that after darkness, light always follows. As the days and months unfolded beyond VE Day, its meaning lingered, not only as a marker of the war's end, but as a quiet turning point. The memory of that moment, of that pause in history when the world exhaled, began to shape the paths people would take. It settled gently into the minds of those who lived through it, and into the stories they would tell. Soft echoes that guided a future shaped not only by victory, but by the longing for peace. In the years that followed, nations rebuilt not only with bricks and timbers, but with ideas born from the hardship and unity of the war. Governments and communities, weary of division and loss, turned toward dialogue. New alliances formed, not from strategy alone, but from a shared understanding of what had been endured. Institutions dedicated to cooperation and peacekeeping emerged, tenderly, like seedlings in spring soil. Europe, so long fractured, began to draw itself together. The people who had once faced one another across barbed wire and broken roads now exchanged letters, goods, and eventually, dreams of shared prosperity. Rail lines that had carried soldiers now carried workers and students. Borders, once fiercely guarded, softened in meaning, at least in hearts and hopes. Veday had taught the world something profound, that peace once found must be nurtured with care. Not guarded with fists, but held with open hands. This idea became a quiet undercurrent in political halls and public parks, in schools and places of worship. Education grew, not just in classrooms, but in the way people viewed their neighbors, near and far. In homes across the globe, families shaped their lives around this shift. Children born after the war grew up hearing the stories of the day the lights came back on, of flags gently waved in silence, of songs sung under the stars without fear. These stories weren't always told in grand detail. Often, they came in moments, a parent pausing at a calendar date, a photograph placed carefully on a mantle, a flicker of quiet when a bell rang in the distance. Artists, too, were moved by Veday's quiet reverberations. Painters filled canvases with scenes of resilience and recovery, faces lit not by flames of war, but by candles in windows. Writers explored the beauty of ordinary peace. Musicians composed melodies that held within them both mourning and hope, drawing upon the emotional balance of that spring day in 1945. Commemorations began, simple at first. A wreath laid on a stone. A poem read beneath a flag. Over time, they grew into ceremonies of remembrance, not to glorify the conflict, but to honor the stillness that followed it. These rituals, gentle and dignified, became part of the post-war world's rhythm, like breaths drawn together by memory. And as the decades passed, Veday remained more than a historical date. It became a reminder, soft and ever-present, of what it means to endure, to hold fast, and to begin again. A symbol not only of victory, but of the precious nature of peace. In this way, the spirit of Veday shaped the world with quiet strength. A day of reflection became a light to guide the years ahead, not in blazing brilliance, but in the calm, steady glow of remembrance and resolve. In the years that followed Veday, its memory did not fade. It softened, deepened, and became part of the world's quiet rituals. Rather than grand spectacles, the day has come to be marked with gestures of gentleness and grace. These acts of remembrance, carried out across generations and borders, offer a soothing thread through time, reminding us not only of what was endured, but of the stillness and hope that bloomed in peace. In cities and towns across Europe, every May 8th arrives with a hush. At dawn, wreaths are laid upon memorials, not hurriedly or with ceremony meant for spectacle, but with care. Red poppies are pinned to lapels and tucked behind ears, their petals delicate as memory itself. Candles are lit and placed on windowsills, their flames flickering in the early morning light. Each one represents a voice once silenced, a life once lived, a hope now carried forward. In London, a 2-minute silence is observed. As the clock strikes 11, traffic slows, conversations pause, and an invisible stillness blankets the city. Office towers, schoolyards, and garden paths fall quiet together. The stillness does not ask for attention. It simply invites reflection. For some, it is a moment of gratitude. For others, a private tribute to someone never returned. And for many, it is simply a space in time, a space in which the noise of the world gently fades. Cathedrals across the continent hold quiet services. The air inside is cool and filled with the soft scent of candle wax and flowers. The music played is neither triumphant nor mournful, but somewhere in between, a slow, gentle echo that stirs the heart without demanding anything of it. Readings are offered, often by voices untrained but sincere. Students, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of those who once stood in uniform or waited anxiously at home. In Normandy and the Low Countries, where the land itself remembers, footsteps move softly across beaches and fields. Families walk hand in hand past markers and gravestones, their voices low and their pace unhurried. Some bring folded letters, written decades before. Others leave drawings or paper cranes made by children too young to know the details, but old enough to understand the importance of saying thank you. In North America, too, the day is marked. Flags fly at half-mast. Veterans halls open their doors. School children learn about the war, not as a story of conquest, but as a testament to cooperation, resilience, and the value of peace. Some families light lanterns at dusk. Others gather for quiet dinners, where stories are shared with a softness that invites listening, not instruction. And in private spaces, living rooms, balconies, gardens, many observe in silence. A photo is dusted. A name is whispered. A candle is lit. A moment is taken not to mourn, but to remember, gently and with care. V-Day's traditions do not seek to relive the past, but to honor it with tenderness. They are not loud or sweeping. They do not demand participation. They invite it, gently, patiently, year after year. In this way, the memory of that spring day in 1945 continues to shine. Break. Time, 1-2 hours, not brightly, not loudly, but as a steady, comforting glow. A reminder that even after the darkest of nights, light can return, and that peace, once found, is something always worth remembering. Night has fallen across the landscapes we've visited, and a soft hush has settled once more. The footsteps have quieted, the candles burn low, and the flags flutter gently in the evening breeze. From the bustling heart of London to the quiet porches of small towns, the echoes of VE Day now rest, like petals floating on a still pond. The spring air, cool and fragrant, moves gently through open windows. It carries with it the scent of lilac and fresh earth, the distant chiming of bells, and the remembered warmth of voices raised not in alarm, but in relief. And in that soft air, one can almost hear the collective exhale of a world that has known long sorrow and now tastes the stillness of peace. As we return to the place where we began, a quiet spring morning in 1945, we carry with us the images gently gathered along the way. A woman pausing at her radio, her hands still wet from the sink. A baker dusting off his counter with a renewed sense of purpose. A small girl holding a flag on the mall, watching the lights come back to life. The calm Seine reflecting lantern light in the arms of Paris. We remember the letters, the diaries, the softly spoken prayers. We recall the fields planted anew, the candles lit in reverence, the silent minutes observed in cities that once thundered with fear. And we hold close the understanding that peace, even when fragile, even when incomplete, can arrive in quiet ways. Not always in declarations or fanfare, but in presence, in gentleness, in small acts of remembrance. The world that followed VE Day was not free from hardship, nor untouched by sorrow. But in those still hours of May 8th, something shifted. A door opened toward healing, and people stepped through with cautious hope. They looked up, breathed deeply, and began again. Tonight, as you settle into rest, let that same spirit of calm and renewal wrap around you. Let your breath slow, like the quiet footsteps of those who wandered gently through reopened streets. Let your thoughts drift like smoke, rising from a tea kettle, soft and meandering. Let the weight of the day fall away, replaced by the steady rhythm of peace. The bells have rung. The crowds have returned home. The skies are still. And beneath them, the world sleeps, not in fear, but in stillness, in gratitude, in peace. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey. I hope it brought you a little peace, a little wonder, and a little closer to rest. Until next time, sweet dreams.